David, you see, he could not escape either his past, what God had done in and through him, and he could not escape his future, what God had determined for him. And that grace in the midst of his going his own way and trying his own thing is what preserved him. And it is a powerful lesson to us that our God is greater than our sin. It is no excuse for our foolishness and our folly and our hard-headedness, but it is a mercy that we ought to be so thankful for. So I would like you to open your Bible to 1 Samuel 21. 1 Samuel 21, we're continuing a couplet of stories in this chapter, and we're entitling today's study, Crazy Good Escape. Now, speaking of escapes, it makes me think about my dog. Our dog's name is Shadow. Can you guess why? Now, this was taken, I think, 5 years ago, and everyone's a little bit younger, and everyone has aged except my wife, who manages to... You remember I said that now. Those are some brownie points. Shadow is her name. Now, I am a language person, and we have picked up a few nicknames, just a few. I actually made a list of them a year ago, and my last count is 35. And they're things like Wuff-a-lot, Wuff-a-poo, Wuffa-pooski wooski, it's really getting out there, Scruffy puppy, Scruff-a-pup, and so on. Now, I didn't mention last week when we were reading about David being there with Ahimelech, and there was also the Edomite named Doeg. That's actually one of our dog's nicknames. When she misbehaves and eats things that she's not supposed to eat, which happens more often than I like to admit, I call her Doeg the Edomite. And she, of course, this is lost on her. She doesn't understand the gravity of that name. Now, one of the earliest nicknames she ever earned was because of something she did during a church on Sunday morning. As a puppy, they chew everything. So before church, we would put her in a large cage in our master bedroom, and then everything would be safe. So we thought, well, one Sunday we came home from church, and she is in the backyard. We did not leave her in the backyard. Apparently, she managed to squeeze through the gate on the cage, found the only open window in the house, burst through that, and was running around in the yard, and eventually she was hanging around by the back gate, and some neighbor let her in. So from that moment on, one of her nicknames was Houndini, named after the great escape artist Harry Houdini. Well, all of that's lighthearted introduction to a story of dramatic escape that we're going to read today in 1 Samuel 21. We find David on the run again. For the 6th time, we find him running from the reach of Saul. Last week, he had fled from the capital city of Gibeah down to Nob, the city where the priests were, to find sanctuary there. Although he wasn't seeking the Lord of the sanctuary so much as he was trying to cobble together his own way out of his mess, he lied his way into getting supplies and the sword of Goliath. I didn't mention this last week, but that's not the last time someone has showed up at the sanctuary and lied about what they were up to. There's plenty of times where people will come to church and they seek help, but they're not really telling you everything, as they have some other motives. Well, in today's passage, he flees again, but he goes from the pot into the fire. He ends up in what seems like an impossible situation, and the only way he can think to get out of it is to do something crazy. Actually, to pass himself off as crazy. And somehow, by God's grace, it actually works. And it ends up being a crazy good escape. David's crazy escape from Gath reveals how God's gracious protection of his chosen ones is stronger than our foolish efforts to keep ourselves. And that is good news. I've mentioned already that David's on the run. Actually, from chapters 20 to 26, David is on the run. It's a period of perhaps 5 to 6 years where he's fleeing Saul's attempt to kill him. In the last story last week, we saw David do some questionable things. In this story, he's going to do some absolutely crazy things. And we could argue whether or not which things he does are sinful or not, but certainly his destination that he picks, to go to Gath, was an utterly foolish thing to do. And then his escape tactic, though it turns out to be effective, is utterly degrading and unfitting of him. One thing's clear, though, that God is with him. God's grace is greater than all his sin. This is an incredibly intense time in David's life. He'll be running from Saul after this point for months, for years, and yet out of this experience, out of this trial of his faith, this testing of his life, there will grow some of the sweetest songs. There are 7 psalms at least that are written out of experiences during this period. We looked at Psalm 34 a few Sunday nights ago, and tonight we'll be looking at Psalm 56, which tells us it is directly connected to the events of this story. Out of this time of trial, David will learn invaluable lessons of faith in God's unfailing promise. I'd like us to read now these verses at the end of chapter 21. Would you come with me to verse 10? We read, "Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s?' David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands, scribbled on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva run down into his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, 'Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house?' Verse 1, so David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. David's crazy escape from Gath shows how God's gracious protection of us, his chosen ones, is stronger than even our foolish efforts to keep ourselves. We're going to see 3 points in this story this morning. We'll see, firstly, the desperate destination of Gath, painful praise for the hero, and finally, an unlikely escape from death. Come with me now back to verse 10, where we'll consider the desperate destination of Gath. Gath is a place that is out of Saul's reach. The verse again says, David arose, fled that day from Saul, and went to Achish, king of Gath. Now, David had been at Nob, a city a few miles down the road from the capital. Now, Saul was not there personally, but his evil network was certainly there. Remember that name, Doeg, which we mentioned before. We've not heard the last of him. He will do something fierce and terrible in the next chapter. So when this verse says that he fled from Saul, it must mean that he is fleeing from Saul's territory. You can see a close-up on the map here. This map has listed some of the places that David would run to over the next number of years. He was over at the 4th place, Nob, on the right, and then he makes his way over to Gath. And you can see by the contours of that map that he is no longer within the governance of Israel. He is now in the land of Philistia. Apparently, he's more afraid of Saul than he is of the Philistines. Gath was 23 miles from Nob, and that's if you're a crow. If, depending on what route David took by mountain road, it was 26 to 35 miles of walking. This is a journey of a couple days, at least. He had plenty of time to think about where he was going. As he would descend 2,600 feet from the hill country up there in Judah, meander his way down to the valley of Elah, where he had killed Goliath, and then make his way out towards the coast at Gath. David's descent is not just about altitude. It's also a little bit of a descent into insanity. What on earth are you thinking about, David? Because this location is not only out of Saul's reach, it is also, and there's a picture of the remains of Gath. You can see it's all flat land around there, except for the mound of the city. It's not only out of Saul's reach, it is out of David's mind. What are you doing? He went to, the end of the verse says, went to Achish, king of Gath? Now, all right, in one sense, going outside the borders of the country makes sense. It's away from Saul. Gath was the closest Philistine city to the cities of Judah, particularly Bethlehem, where he had grown up. He would have had some familiarity with Gath. Saul wasn't fighting the Philistines at this time. He had handed off all of his fighting to David. But what on earth is he thinking? I mean, who came from Gath that we read? Where's the first time we hear about Gath in the book of 1 Samuel? Goliath is from Gath. And what did David pick up from the sanctuary in Nob right before he left? He takes the trophy of Goliath's sword. What on earth is he thinking? What's he going to do with it? Barter it? Hey, you want your sword back? Is he going to show off with it? Probably better off hiding it. We don't know much about King Achish, other than his name is related to Achaia. Remember hearing that place in the New Testament with Paul's team? They go to Achaia. That's Greek for Greek. His name means Greek. And that's not too surprising because the Philistines had immigrated from the Greek islands, it appears, centuries before. Maybe it was even a throne name. There were other people named Achish later on in the book of 1 Samuel. It's kind of like the way the Romans would use the name Caesar for emperors. There was one Caesar, but then there's another one and another one and another one. It's kind of like the way that the popes keep reusing names, like Pope John Paul II, which means this is the second time they've used this poor dead person's name. Ancient kings did this. In Psalm 34, the name of this Philistine king is Abimelech, which means father of a king, which is a Semitic throne name. So anyway, we don't know much about him. It is a curious thing that he's called king because the Philistines didn't normally call their leaders kings. They called them lords. So it seems as though that Gath has become the leading city amongst the five main Philistine cities there out on the coast. And he has some powerful authority. And the word king is going to be used, interestingly, in another verse or two as well. Well, let's consider the question, why has David gone here other than to get away from Saul and other than he's out of his mind? What does he hope to do in this place, this literally God-forsaken place? Is he offering to become a mercenary for them, a paid hitman, a traitor, a Benedict Arnold who can side with them? Maybe he believes the adage is true, my enemy's enemy is my enemy. Later on, a few chapters later, David will fight as a mercenary for the Philistines. In chapter 27, he brings 600 men with him and convinces them that it's clear then that he's at odds with Saul. But at this point, I think that is totally a non-starter. I think really what he's trying to do is just hide away as a refugee. Now, it says that he went to Achish, king of Gath, but that doesn't mean necessarily that he went and introduced himself. Hello, Your Majesty. In the same way, when verse 10 says that David left Saul's presence, Saul wasn't there personally there in Nob either. It was not uncommon for political refugees to go to places where they would never think of going otherwise. He comes in solo. Maybe he tries to hide himself amongst a crowd of merchants and travelers. Maybe he's incognito. Maybe he even tried to hide that sword, which, by the way, is never mentioned again as something he takes with him. Whatever his exact plan is, or was, I think we can all agree it was pretty crazy. Ralph Davis, the commentator, said, one can scarcely believe it. Whatever possessed David to flee to Achish, king of Gath? I mean, would a steer walk knowingly into a meat grinder? Yet here is David showing up in Goliath's hometown with Goliath's sword, apparently hoping to find sanctuary. I suppose David, he says, was thinking Achish would welcome the defection of Saul's prized lieutenant. But Achish's lieutenants, servants, and advisors saw it differently. There were more than one or two reasons David would not be welcome in Gath. What, for instance, would the widows of the Philistine veterans think? And even David had, in his hurry, had probably weighed such reasons. The fact that he still took the risk indicates how desperate he was. When Achish is my best hope, I am in real trouble. End quote. Yes, there we have our own Achishes and Gaths that we turn to when we think that it's all up to us and we've got to do something drastic and something even foolish instead of acting out of faith and resting in God. Instead of trusting in the Lord with all our hearts, when we lean unto our own understanding, we take ourselves into a world of hurt. This is a desperate destination that David has chosen here in verse 10. And we'll see what a foolish move it is when we come to verse 11 as we hear some painful praise for the hero. There's going to be some wonderful things said about David, but by people who hate his guts, and they don't think it's so wonderful. The first thing we notice in verse 11 is this unwitting prophecy. And these Philistines are right about David's future. They've got something right. Verse 11 begins, "But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David, the king of the land?'" Saul's, Achish's courtiers, his lieutenants, recognize or at least figure out who David is, which I think suggests that he tried to come in undercover. He doesn't come introducing himself. And look at this title they give him. Isn't this the king of the land? Now, that's an unusual phrase in a couple ways. Firstly, because it's not the typical title you would give. I mean, Saul was called king of Israel. This is a little more vague, a little more generic, king of the land, which might suggest they meant it as he was some sort of a powerful local figure as opposed to the king over the whole realm. But more ironically, this word from these Philistine unbelievers is almost like a prophetic word. They say more than they realize, because he, in fact, will become the true king of the land. Samuel, you remember, had anointed him when he was a boy and made, I believe, prophecies over him that he would be the next one. And Saul had been alerted that the kingdom was passing from him. I doubt that the Philistines were aware of what happened back in chapter 16 when Samuel came to Bethlehem. Maybe they knew some of the intrigue that was happening between Saul and David, maybe a little bit of that. But they didn't know they were unintentionally reinforcing the prophetic word of God. David would, in fact, be king in God's time. And he'd govern more of the land than Saul ever had. And he'd even govern some of the Philistines, too. Ralph Davis says, "The Philistines have become prophets who speak far better than they know. They speak the truth, but they cannot see into the real depth of that truth." You know, it reminds me of a person in the New Testament who did something similar. Keep your place here in 1 Samuel 21 and turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 11. John, chapter 11. This is in the passion of our Lord Jesus when he's about to be brought before Caiaphas, the high priest. Look with me at John 11, beginning in verse 47. "Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, 'What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs.'" Verse 48. "If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." It's fitting that one man die for the others. Now, John says, verse 51, now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Caiaphas became an unwitting prophet, said what was true. Yes, Jesus did come to die for the nation, and not just for them, but for all who would believe on his name. God has his ways of reinforcing his truth, sometimes in the most ironic of ways. This is now the fourth time in the stories of David that the kingship of David has been affirmed. First by Samuel himself when he anointed the son of Jesse. Then by Jonathan in chapter 18, who recognized that there was some destiny of glory for David, and he gave him his royal robes. Even Saul has recognized it and has warned Jonathan that if you help him, you will lose the kingdom. And now, of all things, by Philistines. Two of David's friends and two of David's enemies have acknowledged he is the king to be. And the Philistines don't only utter a word of prophecy, but they also offer to David a word of praise, although they're not intending to do either of these things. Look with me at the middle of verse 11, and we hear this praise about his unwanted popularity. These Philistines are mad about David's past. Verse 11 continues, did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul is slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands? I don't know what the song sounded like. But most of the Philistine soldiers probably had never seen David up close, but he couldn't expect to go undetected forever. And once they pieced together who it is, they recall what they had heard and what they had experienced and all the troops that they had lost. They had heard the song of chapter 18, verse 7. After David had defeated Goliath, after he had routed the Philistines, ran through Gath and out to the Philistine plain, and more military campaigns after that, the women of Israel were singing this, and it wasn't intended in any way to slight Saul. Saul and David are bound together in this song. But Saul took offense to it. And the Philistines see that there's something special about David that we don't like. They saw David as a man on the rise and a menace to be destroyed. Now, think about that song that the Israelite women had been singing. David has slain, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now think about it now. Thousands of who? Philistines. Tens of thousands of who? Philistines. The song was about them too. And they didn't want to be included. David's reputation as a Philistine slayer had been reinforced over and over and over again. Not just the Battle of Goliath in chapter 17. Do you remember when David wanted to marry Saul's daughter, Michal, and Saul has this tricky plan. It's all right, I'll let you marry my daughter, but here's the dowry price. Do you remember it? 200 Philistine foreskins. That's a grisly, ghastly proof of death. Actually, he wants 100, and David brings 200. Richard Phillips said, if David had forgotten about the 200 Philistine foreskins, the people of Gath had not. David's experience with the Philistines was summarized back in chapter 18, verse 30. Turn back to that verse with me, a few pages back in your Bible, chapter 18, verse 30. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. So his name was highly esteemed. Mighty man of war. So here's some painful praise from Philistines who have figured out who he is. Now the real plot of the story develops here in verses 12 to 15, where we see the unlikely escape from death. David puts on a crazy good performance in verses 12 to 13. Verse 12 begins, "Then David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath." David hears and understands everything that these Philistines are saying. We assume that they would be speaking Philistine, which was not like Hebrew, but David, having been a neighbor of the Philistines and having fought against Philistines, would have picked up enough Philistine language that he could have understood what they were saying. And he doesn't take these words lightly. The Hebrew text is literally, he placed these words in his heart, an idiom for deep reflection. He's meditating on what they're saying, and it brings him great fear. You know, that's an important lesson. What we meditate on the most will affect us the most. If we meditate on our problems the most, we will fall apart. If we meditate instead on God's promises and the certainty of His presence, we will find our way through our troubles in different ways. But these threats weighed so heavy on his mind that he became terrified, greatly afraid of Achish, wondering what on earth he would do. Do you remember back in chapter 18 when David is rising in popularity and Saul is starting to look at him kind of cockeyed? One of Saul's plans is to keep sending him out to the Philistines so the Philistines will kill him. 3 different verses of chapter 18 iterate that. Now Saul's wish is closer to fulfillment than it's ever been before because of, well, frankly, David's crazy idea of going here in the first place. This is the first time in the stories of David we read about him being afraid. This is the same man who writes so eloquently things like, "In the Lord I put my trust. What can mere man do to me?" And you know what? He wrote those words after this story. He learned the value of faith over fear. He's a man who speaks often very eloquently of trusting in God, but don't think that his faith had only high points. There were plenty of low points too, as we have in the story. And here he's not just afraid, he is very afraid. Now, I want to say that there is a kind of fear, if you will, that can be healthy. If we mean by that being startled into action, as opposed to being panicked. If you're on the sidewalk and you hear a big truck barreling down on you, there's going to be an immediate fear reaction, and you're going to do something. That's healthy. That's okay. But it's when you are stuck and frozen in your state of fear and you can't think about what you should do, or you can't even think that there's anything God can do for you, that fear crosses the boundary into sin. What's so sad about David's position here is that there was no reason for him to be in this situation to begin with. He's made a really, really dumb decision. He passed by many safe places of refuge on his way to Gath. In fact, when he's done with this, he'll go back to one that he may well have passed by, the cave at Adullam. So in one sense, he's brought this fearful situation on himself. And then add to that, he has been in some worse situations before. I mean, is this situation any more scary than facing Goliath? I suppose David has other Israelites around him, but it didn't matter if Goliath had come with a tank and an airplane. He was no match for God's might through him. The only other time in the stories of David that we read about him being afraid is another time when he does something stupid. In 2 Samuel 6, when he's now king, and he's moving the tabernacle to Jerusalem, and he's moving the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and he doesn't do it according to the law. And God slays the priest, and David is afraid. I think his fear here as in that time, has been triggered by something foolish that he has done. But David will learn from it, and as we will learn tonight in Psalm 56, the poignant lesson of not living in constant fear, how that is so unproductive. At this point, though, in the story, he's not yet fully grasped that lesson. So he improvises, and he comes up with what he thinks is the best thing to do. And it is literally a crazy idea. Verse 13, so he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. He basically starts acting like a blithering idiot. This expression, he acted insanely, that's the same kind of phrase you describe what drunks do. Starts scribbling nonsense on the gates. The word for scribbling suggests writing that isn't even real words. Etching into the wood with a stone or whatever he's found. None of it makes any sense. I would imagine he's mumbling to himself and groveling. The graffiti removal department of Gath is not going to be well pleased with this. Sputtering nonsense and slobbering all over himself. So much so, so much slobber that his long beard has become soiled with slobber. And we're talking about in a part of the world, in a part of history where the long beard of a man is a symbol of his dignity. There are fights, duels that start over cutting someone's beard. There are wars that start over shaving off people's beards. And here he's willing to degrade himself. Anyone who would do this to himself is a clear sign of derangement. So he's acting like a madman. What is David's hope in acting this way? Why does he think this might accomplish anything? We can only theorize. One theory is that he's hoping to disguise his identity, that they will think he's not really David, he really is a madman who claims to be David. Back in the 1800s, there were a lot of people who thought they were Napoleon. And they walked around with their hands in their jackets, and some of them were too tall, but nonetheless, they fooled themselves into thinking they were Napoleon. Maybe David thinks Achish will ignore what his lieutenants have said, that he's really David. He's just a nut. I've had my share of those over the years who've shown up and told me. I remember one man was high on something, interrupted a service, and when I approached him, he told me that he was Jesus. And I said to him, well, Jesus told us not to believe people when they said something. So then he said, well, no, I'm John the Baptist. And I thought, okay, well, that's fine then. That's maybe he thinks he can convince him that he's just an imposter, a crazy imposter. Maybe he's trying to pass himself off as a possessed man. People who had epileptic seizures in ancient days were often thought to be either possessed by spirits or in touch with the spirit world. And therefore, while you didn't want them around you in normal society, you couldn't harm them because you might anger the spirits. And so there's actually incantations and things that pagan priests and shamans would execute to try to soothe these sorts of people, but they would be escorted out to the perimeter of society. One commentator said that Achish probably held the common ancient superstition that harming a lunatic would bring bad luck. Even prophets in Israel, both true prophets and false prophets, were sometimes known for being rather erratic. Do you remember in one of Saul's crazy fits, turn back to chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18, verse 10. Chapter 18, verse 10. Now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand, as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand, and you know what Saul tries to do. It says in the middle of the verse, he raved in the midst of the house. The Hebrew term is he acted like a prophet, because some prophets were known for being sort of ecstatic and seemingly uncontrolled. This is ironic, isn't it? You see, Saul, on a number of occasions, is controlled by madness. And yet here is David, who is controlling madness, acting mad to actually accomplish something. Robert Bergen said that David takes on himself the trappings of insanity to hide his sanity. Saul surrounds himself with the trappings of sanity to cloak his insanity. A great inversion. Well, whatever David's rationale was, and whatever the king's thoughts were, one thing we know for sure, it worked. Somehow, some way, this crazy idea worked. John Woodhouse says, and what an act David put on for them. Slobbering hysterically, scraping the door with his nails, David put on the performance of his life. He contrived to change the fear and hatred of him to something else, and amazingly, he succeeded. Well, look with me lastly at verses 14 to 15 at Achish's sarcastic dismissal. Verse 14, then Achish said to his servants, behold, do you see the man behaving as a madman? Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen? That you brought this one to act the madman in my presence. Shall this one come into my house? 3 times the king uses this term madman or madmen, which is, there's a Yiddish word that comes right from this word. It's pretty much the same pronunciation. It's meshugana. You ever heard that? He's meshugana. He's crazy. That's the word used here. And 3 times the king asks, why are you bringing him to me? What am I supposed to do with him? Now, Gath certainly had its cadre of odd citizens. I mean, there were people with absurd height, like Goliath and his brothers. There's later a record of one person who has 24 digits. Some people appeared to have more height than they had sense in this city. I'm sure the king is exaggerating somewhat, as kings are wont to do, and unsatisfied with the people in their presence. But Achish does not want to bother with David at all. No admittance into this royal precinct. We're not even going to put him in the jail. He's going to be gone. And as one commentator put it, Achish withdraws his visa and puts him on the first flight out of Gath. David is released, we infer, because of what verse 1 of chapter 22 says. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. He heads east 10 miles into the base of the hill country of Judah and finds a cave. Achish sends him slobbering on his way to a place he probably should have gone to in the first place, because it was better to be alone and trust the Lord than to put himself into the hands of the Lord's enemies. David's crazy escape from Gath reveals how God's gracious protection of his chosen ones is stronger than our foolish efforts to keep ourselves. 2 things have been at work throughout this story: David's crazy desperateness and also God's undeserved graciousness. God gets all the glory for David getting out of this situation. David does not leave this story as a glorious, honorable man. The last scene is him as a blithering idiot. But God is gracious nonetheless. David, you see, he could not escape either his past, what God had done in and through him, and he could not escape his future, what God had determined for him. And that grace in the midst of his going his own way and trying his own thing is what preserved him. And it is a powerful lesson to us that our God is greater than our sin. It is no excuse for our foolishness and our folly and our hard-headedness, but it is a mercy that we ought to be so thankful for. Robert Vanoy said that chapter 21 provides a wake-up call for God's believing people of all times and all places. It's a reminder that, 1, living as a Christian in a fallen world is inherently dangerous. 2, on our own foolish behavior often heightens the danger of this hostile world. And 3, God's mercies are new each day in spite of our failures. And 4, God's purposes for his people cannot be frustrated by the designs of the ungodly. What grace is at work there? You and I have, if you are in Jesus Christ, there are promises that have been made over you, promises made to each of us about God keeping us to the end, about the promise that you will one day be seated in full glory with Jesus. And we can do some really dumb things and get ourselves into some big messes. But thanks be to God, those mistakes are not big enough to remove us from the saving plan that we find in Jesus Christ our Lord. And even these bad times, these low points, there are great things to learn. And so I encourage you, come back tonight when we look at Psalm 56 and we consider, can any good thing come out of Gath? Yes, it's the stuff that Psalms are made of.